Hello, good morning, and welcome everyone to the 9th annual Vision Zero Cities Conference. My name is Jessie Singer. I am senior strategist and head writer at Transportation Alternatives, as well as a journalist and the author of the book There Are No Accidents, published by Simon & Schuster this year. In a moment, I will get us started on an exciting panel that we're calling Enough with the Ease, about the overprevalence of education and enforcement in the discussion of Vision Zero. But since this is the very first panel of the first day of the Vision Zero Cities Conference, I'd like to take a minute on behalf of Transportation Alternatives to welcome everyone to the conference and do a little housekeeping. We're very excited to kick off the first day of the 9th annual Vision Zero Cities Conference with a day of virtual sessions, this being the first, focused on topics including a safe systems approach, which we'll dive into in a minute, as well as other sessions on Vision Zero initiatives from around the world, using speed management to save lives, and a virtual keynote by Ann Carlson, Acting Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. For those of you in New York City, we hope to see you tonight at our, for those of you in New York City, we hope to see you at our in-person portions of the conference, including our opening reception tonight, a full day of thought leadership, peer learning, and networking tomorrow at the Center for Architecture, and a packed day of field tours and deep dive trainings on Friday. Tonight's reception is outdoors, so be sure to dress warm. You can see a link to our full program and speaker lineup in the chat. There you can also find our 2022 Vision Zero Cities Journal, which includes 12 powerful articles on street safety innovations from across the world. This year is the first time since 2019 that we've been able to gather this community of advocates and experts, at least partially in person as well as online, and we are honored to have you all with us. No matter how you're participating. Thank you all for all that you do for this shared movement to make Vision Zero a reality on our streets. And with that, let's get started on Enough with the Ease. Here's what we're going to talk about today. When Vision Zero first spread across the US, the traditional safe systems approach that had been saving lives across Europe was downplayed for a focus on the centuries-old 3 E's: education, enforcement, and engineering. One result we've seen from that is an overemphasizing of education and enforcement efforts, which has led to some ineffective and definitely inequitable outcomes. All the while, re-engineering our roadways has gotten a short shrift of attention and resources. Today, we'll talk about where we've gone wrong, the problems with education and enforcement-centric approaches, and how we can refocus on self-enforcing streets, speed management, and a true safe systems approach. Like I said, I'm Jessie Singer, senior strategist and head writer at Transportation Alternatives. I will be your host, and I would like to introduce our truly esteemed panelists. We're really lucky to have all these folks with us today. First up, we're going to hear from Zabe Bent, Director of Design at the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Zabe has 20 years of experience in multimodal planning and urban development with a focus on conceptual design, transit planning, and engagement. As Director of Design, she leads NACTO's training program and guides technical publications while writing, sketching, and baking in Atlanta. Seth LaJeunesse is the Research Associate at the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center. Seth designs studies that draw from psychology, sociology, and systems science to advance equity, justice, safety, and access in transportation. He's a member of the Transportation Research Board's Pedestrians Committee, the Transportation Safety Management Systems Committee, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, and the National Safety Council's inaugural Mobility and Safety Advisory Group. And then last but not least, we have Leah Sham, the founder and director of the Vision Zero Network. Leah's researched Vision Zero strategies in Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands as a German Marshall Fund Fellow. With the Vision Zero Network, she leads a national campaign supporting communities working towards Vision Zero, zero fatalities and severe injuries. The network helps communities develop and share best practices for safe mobility for all road users. And yeah, now that everyone's introduced, let's get started. Our panelists are going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, each on one of the 3 E's. Zabe will get us started by sharing new research on the problems with the enforcement approach. And with that, I will turn it over to them.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to go through this pretty quickly. I think most people know who NACTO is, but just There we go. We are the National Association of City Transportation Officials. We're based in the US and Canada with about almost 100 cities and transit agencies who are our members. And they're sort of who we work with and cater to try to work towards sustainable, safe, and equitable transportation improvements. I want to start by grounding us in what I think most folks already know here, and that is that we're all working towards safer communities, safer streets, safer cities. And obviously, we also know that NHTSA has released new information for this year that puts us, pretty much not doing so well on that safety goal. And so I want to start by just grounding us in where we're trying to get. We're trying to actually stem the tide of drastically increasing, consistently increasing traffic fatalities. That's affecting, obviously, not just pedestrians and bicyclists, who are the most unprotected and also often the most marginalized in our communities, but also drivers. And so this is something that affects everyone, every user of the road, and something that we all need to pay attention to. In urban areas, arterials make up 15% of streets, but they are 73% of traffic deaths, and that's a huge concern. And also, because of the sort of character of arterials and the ownership of arterials, they're in some ways the hardest to affect, but also a place where a lot of our enforcement happens. And so, one, I want to just flag that, one of the problems with enforcement is inequity. It's really not affecting everyone in the same ways, and it's also not effective. And when we look at income equity, we can already see that we're not really having a huge dent, in that it's affecting people at the lower strata of income. And so income inequality is a huge problem here. And then also race and ethnicity, where we're seeing huge issues here as well. Where Black or African-American and Indigenous folks are more impacted than other groups. This also tracks when we look at age, when we look at ability. And so again, we need to really focus on what's happening. I'm going to talk a little bit first about traffic fatalities and specifically speed enforcement, because that's the thing that we're most accustomed to, right? Like, everyone has had an experience where they know the speed limit, they understand how that works. And we have, experienced getting tickets or being afraid of getting tickets or not, and how that works. And that's certainly something that most people can understand. But part of the problem is not just the fact that the enforcement is inequitable, but that it's really not sort of pinned on anything that sort of makes sense. We're enforcing this vicious cycle, essentially, where we are setting our streets, our posted speed limits at the wrong number, and it's having this impact. And we're enforcing that. And the way that we set our limits also reinforces the bad behavior. And then we're enforcing that too. It's sort of a gotcha to drivers, and it's not having the outcomes that we want to see. And that's just one example that we can mostly resonate with. And when we look at cycling, this is an example that I really want to highlight, is that safety can't just mean safety from crashes. And so this is an impact where obviously the impact itself, that the safety outcome that we want, isn't really landing and it isn't really leading to anything. Our traffic deaths are going up every single year, but also the impact that it has on how enforcement is applied isn't really landing when we look across the different types of people, the diversity that makes up cities, the diversity that we all love to see in cities. We are seeing people who are affected very differently. And people who look like me, for example, are very concerned about the way that enforcement lands. And we look at Jijan Kizzy in California, who, after a bike stop, for what reason exactly, we don't exactly know, was shot and killed. And so, like, this is one of the things that we wanted to make sure to understand, that there are both undue impacts that are affecting people's lives and livelihoods, as well as the actual safety outcome itself. And here's just one example to think about. In most cities, you are not lawfully allowed to ride on the sidewalk. When we look at that, what is the option in this particular case? This is in New York and in Brooklyn. And so here, I think it's important to understand why someone would ride on the sidewalk and why we would have a law preventing that in a case where the safe option for most people would seem to be to ride on the sidewalk. But people don't put themselves at risk for no reason, typically. And so it's impossible to make a good decision here because we, as transportation engineers, as street designers, haven't made it possible for people to make the safer decision. And yet we're enforcing that outcome rather. And so here, in this example, 50% of people on bikes were in fact riding on the sidewalk. And then here, when there's an actual infrastructure improvement, 3% of people on bikes were riding on the sidewalk. And so here, again, it falls to us to make the decision to make it really obvious for people what that looks like and how to change the paradigm. But I also want to talk through like what it means to even have that law on the books, and to make sure that we're thinking about what those laws mean and what we can do either as designers or as lawmakers, as advocates, to change the way that our system is. We don't have to live this way, is essentially what I want to leave you all with. And look at laws that regulate equipment, laws that regulate behavior, laws that regulate location, and think about what the actual impact on safety is. And in many cases, not very much. For example, like you can be stopped if your bike is not clean. Why? In a lot of different cities. And so this, again, is a reason to say, like, why would this happen? Why would this be a part of our system? Who is it impacting, and how is it impacting safety? And who is it impacting in a detrimental way? And I want to end with a quote from Anna Presley at NACTO this past fall, I don't even know. If we can legislate hurt and harm, then we can legislate equity and justice. So again, focusing on our outcomes and really thinking about what enforcement means and how it actually contributes to the safety and the sustainability and the equity that we want to see. And with that, I will turn it over to, I think, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Zabe. I love the way you broke that down. And I think, really we're dealing with challenging issues. Education and enforcement have been burned into our brains as the right answer for such a long time. I'm grateful for the way you've kind of taken us slowly through perhaps why it's not working so well for us. Before we get to Seth, who's going to talk to us a little bit about education, a quick apology from me. It's obviously the first panel of the day. I forgot to let you all know that everyone should drop questions in the Q&A section, and feel free to do it throughout the panels, and I'll field them to the panelists later on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Seth. And yeah.
Thanks so much, Jessie. And Zabe, that was awesome. Thank you. It's really hard to follow you, just so you know that. I do want to lift up a couple of things before I get into the meat of my argument. Jessie had mentioned at the outset that what we're talking about today has at least a 100-year history. This is something historian Peter Norton has sort of informed us about. These E's have come from this sort of professional class of people who thought that they could protect people by building safer roads, enforcing the laws, and educating people about how to behave out there. And Zabe said many things, too many things to lift up, but I wanted to just highlight some of the things throughout what I'll talk about today, which is the education E that you're probably all familiar with. I'm just going to be frank and say that most education campaigns are wasteful, they're dangerous, and they're inequitable. And I'm going to keep going back to those three: wasteful, dangerous, and inequitable. And I want to just start with just painting the picture of the reality that we have out there. The reality, basically just part of the reality with the people who use our roads. One is drivers. Part of the reason, part of what education campaigns are about are informing people about how to behave and assuming that they might not know how to behave. I will counter that by saying that most drivers, maybe not all, know that drunk and distracted driving is less safe than sober and focused driving. We can probably all agree to that, right? Most people on foot and bike as Zabe was saying, most people don't put themselves at risk knowingly. Most people on foot or bike know that drivers of these increasingly large vehicles we see out there can be harmed or killed by them. In fact, most of us, if you think about our socialization, from a very shockingly early age, we learned that walking or cycling or running out into the street is fraught with danger. The adults in our lives tell us this ad nauseum. That's one of the first dangers we learn of growing up. Yet, when we look at the human nature, right, our natural selves, we tend to be impatient, impulsive, we're bound to err. We make all kinds of misjudgments depending on the situation, depending on how hurried we are, depending on how distracted we are by all the stimulation in our environments. So we have to really think about how people, human beings, are using the environments that we have been given, basically. Another part of our reality is that most drivers, about 80% in most estimates that we see, they firmly believe that they are better than the average driver, which is a statistical impossibility, right? You can't have 80% of people being better than average. Because of these realities, right, that we know what is unsafe for the most part, that we are very human, and that drivers overestimate their capacity or their competency, if you will. Again, these education campaigns with their vague wording and framing, and they're targeting it at everybody. So think about campaigns you might be familiar with, like be smart, be safe, be seen. Who is that targeting exactly? Or safety is no accident. Okay, maybe I accept that. What does that mean for how I should behave out there? Safety is free, use plenty of it. These are all campaigns that are really quite popular out there into various communities. They're wasteful, dangerous, and totally inequitable. In fact, in National Cooperative Highway Research Program report, you can look at it, report 622, it's called The Effectiveness of Behavioral Highway Safety Countermeasures. These are called voluntary action programs. Basically, an example would be look before you cross the street. They're feel-good programs. They create the appearance of doing something when in reality, again, they're wasteful in that they use resources that could be put to better use. Things like short educational videos about how and why road diets and protected intersections benefit all of us, or positive social norming messaging around driver yielding to people or car occupants wearing seatbelts. So if we have high rates of these things, those positive social norms, we can convey those. Dangerous in the fact that they reinforce what we would call safety individualism. It's the notion that individuals are wholly responsible for their own safety. The problem with this is that it ignores the broader context, right, in which road trauma plays out. So just a couple of phenomena that are happening in our culture, right, is the suburbanization of poverty. So part of that is like placing people with limited car access in auto-dominated spaces. So they have to contend with that now. The growth in the size and the power of our vehicles. And then these e-commerce delivery of goods that we're seeing more and more of, these Amazon delivery trucks and so on, right? So when we frame road trauma, the very real trauma that happens every day on our roads, we need to speak about this broader context. And then that last point around inequitable, I mean, Zabe laid it out. People are really being harmed by this, and not all groups are being harmed in the same proportion. But basically, these messaging, when you're saying be safe, be seen, you're putting the blame on the very people the system is really not designed for. Consider how law enforcement, the media, decision makers often equate, for instance, the responsibility of different road user groups, right? So I'll just put out there a question around, should we say that a person walking is as responsible for a mistake as a person driving an F-150 or an Amazon delivery truck? Is the child pedestrian as responsible for what happens to her on the roads as the people who design them and build them, or the agencies that regulate vehicle weight and design? Is that what we're really saying? I don't think so. So I'll just end with this idea around any educational messaging we want to advance, which I don't think is a bad thing. We do need to frame safety in a way that's helpful. We can convey three things. The transportation system, number one, is the transportation system we all use is simply not working for really any of us, and especially not for those of us with disabilities, lower incomes, as well as Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. That there's common sense measures we can take to improve this reality, and even providing some examples of those that go beyond personal responsibility. And then lastly, that implementing these measures will benefit all of us and in many ways. So, thank you.
Seth, thank you so much. I really appreciate the way you laid that out. I think education is almost the trickiest of the 3 E's to see because it's so pervasive in our lives. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the last E, the one good E, engineering. And Leah Sham is going to talk about that and how it relates to the safe systems approach. So last but not least, I will turn it over to her.
Thanks, Jessie. And yeah, thank you so much, Labe and Seth, for starting out. I'll just say I really appreciate, Seth, the way you frame the wasteful, dangerous, inequitable. I want to start by saying sometimes this topic that we're talking about can get brushed off as don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. I want to emphasize it is a big deal. It's kind of lurking underneath everything. And if there's 2 things, I'll say 2 things I'm going to ask people to do. Number 1, start calling it out when you see it. And I'll give some examples like we all have. And number 2, we can do differently with some ideas. So again, thinking kind of at the local level, state level, what are things we can do? So just really coming back to one of the principles of a strong Vision Zero approach, and not everyone using the term Vision Zero is actually doing it. Let me start by saying that. But one of them that folks have already hit on is this idea of perfecting human behavior, right? That's partly what this education theme is about. And then this idea of individual responsibility, right? The safety individualism. I really appreciate your framing on that also, Seth. But to think about, we honestly, straight up, we've been doing that wrong. We need to be shifting to acknowledge, hey, people do make mistakes. Sometimes they're kind of forced errors because it's a really crappy road, let's be honest, and they don't have any other choice but to run across, like some of the examples Abe was sharing. And sometimes it is bad decision making, but these things happen. So in terms of really thinking, how are we taking a systems approach to safety? We need to do a lot differently. And I would start by saying, one thing we can do is, I would say personally, I don't know if others that we can talk about this would say, I would say we're not trying to negate any emphasis on the individual E's, but to step back and say, look, this overarching E's approach, this idea of engineering, education, enforcement, emergency services, there's different ways you can slice that, by the way. The idea of these things having equal weight is not valid, is not helping us. It's not true, but it's not doing a good job. Sure, people have been trying to integrate equity and engagement and evaluation in, it's true, but they're still very much siloed. And this is very much, I'd say, at best a crutch, kind of letting us limp along in an ineffective way. At worst, as I think, Seth, you pointed out, I love wasteful, dangerous, and inequitable for the reasons people have talked about. So one thing I'd say, and we can be shifting, is do you need your Vision Zero action plans set up as E's? I would say, no, you don't. And we're starting to see that shift. And I will get to the engineering focus in a second, but even to start and say, for a long time, decades and decades, safety plans have been built on the E's. And it's very much siloed, and it's very much held us back, and in some places actually done damage. Yeah. So really thinking about what are the goals we want. We want safe streets. We want safe speeds. Let's integrate in course safe vehicles in. Is there still a role for safe people? Of course there is, yes. But how do you right size that and fit it in well? So again, as people have talked about, we get the results we design for, right? What's the great safe choice here? What's the great safe choice here? Walking or biking, not great choices because the environment is not safe, right? We know it's a physics issue of speed. We know we can design for what we want. And I think, I don't know if this is the same one you had referred to or not, but if folks don't know it, this is a study from last year from the Journal of Transport Land Use, really showing we know where people are getting hit and killed walking also. We know what kinds of roads they are. We know what we need to do in terms of fixing deadly streets. And moving to that, I want to give a big shout out to TA. You guys have done great work on really promoting the concept of self-enforcing streets. Does that mean it's going to be 100%? No, but we're going from literally, if you see the pictures here, we're going from streets that literally, knowingly encourage unsafe behavior. Literally, there's no denying that. We know, and Zabi, you shared some great examples of before and after, but you've got this 6-lane or 4.5 lane maybe road where people are going to drive faster. We know that because that's the way the lanes are designed and the streets designed. On the picture on the right, where it looks like the person in purple is crossing, it does not look like they have a good crosswalk choice, right? These are not surprises. These are absolutely predictable and they're absolutely preventable. So how are we shifting blame? And we literally are. In a way, it's, saying, hey, let's focus on I sometimes call them the softies of education and enforcement, while avoiding or looking past these hard things. And I do want to be honest, this isn't going to be super easy to fix all our arterials. I'm not pretending like we can do it like that, but keeping our heads in the sand is not working well. I just had to share this one because it was just last week. I'm sure a lot of people heard it, or read about this, but it was really, bothered to read that this young man at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, Indiana, was hit and killed. He was riding a scooter. He was hit and killed by someone driving a car who was suspected of being a drunk driver, who drove up on the curb on the sidewalk and hit him. Sorry, I'm missing a slide here. I apologize, but awful in every way. The mayor of Bloomington and the city council of Bloomington responded with new rules for scooter riders in the city. You can't ride in the dark, and a whole slew of reminders about safety on scooters. Nothing in particular about drivers, nothing about the design of that street, which I don't know about, but nothing about speeds, nothing about speed governors or alcohol detection systems or the designs of the road. Absolutely, I think a perfect example of this idea of wasteful, dangerous, and inequitable. What message is that sending to tens of thousands of students at that university, to everybody reading the papers about what the danger is and what the change needs to be? So really coming back to the idea of, how do we plan for safety? And pulled an image from New York City, a before and after, pretty vivid colors here, vivid change, right? When we give folks space, when we give them space, when we make it predictable, when we know that there's separated space between a vehicle moving, say, at 30 miles per hour and a bicycle moving at 10 miles per hour and a person walking, much slower pace, obviously we're going to have safer conditions. And these are decisions that system planners make, policymakers make. That's your city council, that's your mayor, that's your head of engineering and planning, right? These are the decisions we need to be forcing on them, looking to them for, demanding from them, rather than looking downstream at the individuals who are given poor choices in many cases and may not make the safe choice because they don't have a safe choice. So again, really thinking of this upstream systems approach. So I would really encourage people to think, how are you questioning the work you're already doing? And understanding, I want to pause and say, this can be hard because we're thinking about, oh, am I turning and blaming the colleague next to me? Am I blaming kind of the engineers and planners in the department? I would say it does not need to be that. It doesn't need to be a blame individuals working on this. I do think we need to be recognizing a system that is failing, like others have said, and calling out different ways to do it, but really looking at the system. And I want to give some credit, US Department of Transportation. This is a small thing, but let's hold them to it. Also, because I know we might hear from folks today, but safer people is not just about encouraging behavior, it's about creating the conditions for people to be safe. So let's really hold them to that. And finally, we can make change, and I'll end there. Thank you guys. Super fast.
Thank you so much, Leah. Really appreciate that overview and that big picture. Wow, this is such a great panel. Thank you to all our panelists for where you've taken us so far. So now let's open it up to questions. Folks should drop your questions in the Q&A, and because I have all the power, I get to start. So a big picture question for the group. The education and enforcement paradigm is 100 years old. This is institutional, and it's not just in traffic safety, it's institutionalized, as an answer, education and enforcement are institutionalized as an answer to drug use, to fire safety, to a wealth of, so-called social problems. So how do we challenge both in our cities and in our own communities the idea that the E's are effective and that education and enforcement are effective? How do we convince people that this is not the right way? What have you seen that has been successful, or what tactics are you trying out right now?
I can imagine Leah has some examples.
Well, I don't know if they're examples as much as hopes, because honestly, I don't think we're doing a good enough job of this. I mean, yes, there are more of us. And first, Jessie, huge kudos to you for bringing light to this more with your book. I think we're all doing it more in our environments. People aren't going to love to hear this because it's a longer term thing, but along with calling it out day to day more and in our own situations, the need for change, I think we need stronger either research or consolidation of research from quote unquote some respected mainstream people that this isn't working, right? There is some out there, and I guess we could talk about that. I don't think it's given enough attention. Maybe we're not raising it up enough, or it's not kind of coming from the right spokespeople. And I hate to say that, but we do need to do a better job of pointing out, hey, this actually isn't effective. Whether you agree or disagree with the equity arguments, whether you are, super pro police or concerned about police over policing, it's not effective. I feel like if we could, I'd love to find ways to lift that up more effectively. No pun intended, but yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Leah's saying, Jessie, in this space. We have an example locally here. I think something that is in sort of the broader milieu is talking about sort of local journalism and how that is sort of vanishing in our culture, which is problematic. But I have an example of in Chapel Hill where we have a local sort of media outlet where they started out a story of an adolescent cyclist, I think, involved in a crash, and framed the incident in a very sort of victim blaming way. At first, a colleague, Tab Combs, and I actually sort of tag team to reach out to these people on Twitter, I believe it was, and just said, hey, maybe try not to victim blame, talk about a little bit of context. They actually did change their approach. They updated the story. This is only because we have access to local journalists. This is sort of critical for the public discourse around this. That's just one example. But media definitely is a key player in this space, because this is, some of our research finding that's how most people interface with the problem of the road trauma is through the media. This is not often, it's not at cocktail parties where people are encountering this, but so yeah, I think there's some examples where we can make good inroads where you have connections, especially with people who can broadcast messaging.
Yeah, I agree with both of those things. I think it's important to focus on the cultural changes that need to happen and to make those inroads. We also do need to change our regulations, our standards, our laws. Culture change takes a lot longer than that, and a lot of people don't have that time. People are literally dying. So I think it's important to make sure that we are going at this in a systematic way, that we are looking at it and chipping away at each of these different factors, because each of them has an impact, and it is cultural change that we're trying to affect.
Thank you, everyone. That's I think that's spot on. And part of getting at why this is so tricky. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here are institutions. And there's a question in the chat that I think gets at that a little, which is, if you're starting a Safe Streets campaign that's focused on design and engineering rather than enforcement and education, what are some good examples of community coalition partners and allies? And what's a good way to start conversations with them? I think this is a good question because it gets at the idea that the police and education groups are institutions in our society that are, well-funded and, kind of brick and mortar. And so how do you find partners and build campaigns when you're focused instead on road design and engineering?
That's a great question. I think, as folks are doing more and more, really elevating the the picture of what's happening on the streets, which is often so disturbing, of where is your highest concentration, just your disproportionate concentration of injuries, of crashes, of fatalities. Time and time again, I'll say, we know this in cities, it's low-income communities, it's communities of color, it's people walking and biking, right? Are there ways to really invite the communities where they are most affected? Is those communities being most, negatively impacted, inviting them in to really, see that, understand that. It may feel like one-offs, right? Like Seth's example of the media, it's very one-off in the media, right? Oh, this thing happened. But no, when you look, you go, wow, it's happening in my neighborhood, right? So, is it groups like city agencies? Is it walking and biking safety groups? Is it youth-oriented groups, others that are connecting with the community neighborhood groups that are most disproportionately impacted, but then actually working with them to say, okay, what would be better, right? This massive, nasty street where people getting hit regularly. This is not quote unquote an accident, right? This is something we can generally predict will happen, and we can change it. What do we want to change? So kind of not waiting for that trickle down approach of, oh, where's funding for a project? Let's go do that project, right? But trickle it up in a way of, where are the problems happening, and really engaging the community of what do we want to be different there, and pushing that upwards.
Does anyone else have thoughts on that? If not, I have another good question, which is this. So kind of asking the same question about partnerships, but talking about local government. I think one thing we see a lot is that local governments are focused on education campaigns. And one of the reasons is that it's cheap and it's easy. And it's a way to say, I reached a ton of people. I reached everyone with this billboard, where an intersection redesign might exist only in one neighborhood and take longer to implement. So what are some best practices for working with local governments effectively that are focused, when those governments are focused on education campaigns and persuading them towards engineering, which reaches fewer people and takes longer to implement?
That's a great question. I wish I had dozens of examples of that. I'm not aware of this being a very common practice. I'm sure it happens. I guess just to take a step back around questioning, why is messaging safe? Why is it easy? Why is it always a go-to? And I think it's deep. Zabe mentioned regulation that's needed. Clearly, we need regulation, right? Why do we not see support for regulation? And I think it's deep-seated sort of cultural mindsets around at least one of them, individualism. Very much so, you are, what befalls you is your fault. So you can see, if you start with this mindset, you might be more likely to be like, oh yeah, we just need to tell people how to behave, right? It's super easy. And almost everybody, no one's really going to challenge that. See, that's the problem we have right now, is that there isn't major pushback to these feel-good campaigns. And yes, they're cheap, easy. And that's therein lies much of the problem. So yeah, the question is, how do you reframe it so that you then speak to the different programming that's happening in the city? So if we have Vision Zero cities working, how are you talking about what you're doing, how you're designing the different sort of campaigns you have going on that sort of are trying to lift up positive norms? How are you speaking about this as a problem, to Leah's point around, like, to what extent are you saying that this is a system problem versus an individual problem? So there's open-ended questions. I don't know of examples, but maybe Leah and Zabe have some in mind.
I think there are some good examples out there. I guess I would maybe think one way to think is a little differently of, do we need to move that quote unquote education money into an engineering pocket? Maybe, yes, if you can do that, do that. The truth is, and this may not fit as well in the theme today, but the education money isn't as substantial as the engineering money. That doesn't mean it's not important. It is important. And I would say it's less important about the amount of money than it is about the amount of wastefulness, danger, and inequity that Seth talked about. So the dollar to dollar thing doesn't doesn't influence me so much. It's kind of, what are you doing? What harm are you doing with this maybe relatively smallish amount of money? I would say this, we can read, we're not going to move away from education completely, right? And I don't think anyone's arguing that. Like, there's got to be some, obviously, like awareness and education, yes, of course, but right size it in a way and expand it to, because there's a lot of money, frankly, that flows from the feds, or money that flows from the feds that says it can only be education for now. Maybe we change that down the road. But in your Vision Zero plan, again, trying to think like really practical for folks maybe at the local or state level, how are you defining education? I would say education could include the great example Seth shared of educating media about crashes, not accidents, about context and understanding why crashes happen where, and how reporting on them responsibly actually, has an impact. That's education. That could use a good amount of money to go educate media in every community. Similarly, educating policymakers around science. I mean, literally that little diagram we all show of, if an average person is hit while walking, say at a car going 20 miles per hour versus 40 miles per hour, your chance of death goes from 10% roughly to 90%. That is science. Like, that is just basic. How about we spend education money going to every city council member and state legislator and engineer and planner and bringing some medical people and some science-minded people? It's not just us, advocates out here trying to show this. It's actually embedded into an education system that our government gets behind. Like, these are things that are education. They're upstream rather than downstream. So I would say, think about the next application you put in for education money, because let's be honest, you're not going to let money just sit. If there's money for education, everybody wants to grab it because it's money to do things. What are you going to do with it? Challenge the paradigm of what you can do.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add here is, and maybe this connects back to the previous question a bit, is I agree wholeheartedly. The idea of who are you educating and what are you educating them for? Like, again, moving away from victim blaming and really trying to make sure that people understand the systems that we're operating within. The other thing is partner with community organizations and document their woes, document the impacts that they have experienced, and see if that is another way to again, shift the paradigm and to make sure that people understand. And again, you would have to have a relationship with community organizations. And there's so many organizations that are doing great work in so many cities on this topic and trying, again, to shift the paradigm, uplift the work that they are doing, and use that as part of your structure as well.
If I could add in, because I just saw someone, I think in a question, reference this, and I think it fits really well into this topic. Education money could be and should be educating about new design, right? I mean, sometimes a new design, it is new. People are like, oh, what does this mean? This green bike box, that's not that new anymore. But, there's this or this or this. There, is there effective promotion and education about not just how to use a new design feature, but why it's beneficial, why it was done, like literally building support for it because it's a safety feature, right? And you could look at an example of, is there a bunch of money going into why, my gosh, why am I blanking? You get the shot for the pandemic. How embarrassing is this? Do you have your booster yet? Right? Like, there's a lot of money saying you should get your boosters, right? And I think that's a good thing. You should do that. It's promotion about doing a healthy, safe thing, like the system thing, right? But it's also, that this thing is a safer thing, right? It's putting money behind the thing, the idea of safety. We could do a better job of that in a lot of ways.
Thanks, everyone. I love how deep we dove on that. I want to make us do the same thing on enforcement too. We're talking about leaving behind police enforcement as a tool for traffic safety, but the police still exist. Do we work with them or not? How do you change a powerful, immovable institution, or do you not? And maybe to get something real specific from the chat, how do you respond when a community is demanding more traffic enforcement? I'm sure we'll have a field day with that, so I'll leave it to you.
I mean, I think there's so many ways to answer this question. One thing I would say is people are demanding traffic enforcement because they're demanding safer streets. And it's important for us who work in this field and who have a broader view. This is part of the education, in my opinion, is to figure out how do we educate ourselves on what they are actually asking for? You know, sometimes someone comes to you and says, this is the thing that I want a stop sign on the street. Actually, what you really want is fill in the blank, some other thing, right? You don't really want a stop sign. You don't necessarily want traffic. You want a safer street. And it's important to figure out what is the solution that's going to get people there and bring them along in that conversation. That's the type of education that I think we should be doing. The other component is to figure out what is the outcome that we are actually looking for, and will traffic enforcement get us there? What is the type of traffic enforcement that gets us there? And to really interrogate that question, and again, to bring folks along as we're having that conversation. We are in a world where police enforcement is just simply part of our system right now. It's going to take a long time to unwind that and to figure out what are the places and ways that it makes sense to keep them embedded versus to move to another system, and to figure out how we work together, because every single person involved in this has a role to play, every single partner, right? The community, media, elected officials, policymakers, you know, designers and planners and engineers. We each have a different role to play, and it's important to understand how those roles work together and to understand the perspectives that each person is bringing. It simply doesn't have to be the same way all the time, and to continue a system that basically isn't working. Traffic enforcement as we know it today is not working. Our traffic fatalities are increasing every single year. And we also know that there are undue impacts from that. So if we look at those outcomes, I think we'll end up in different places if we say, what are we actually solving for?
Yep, I just want to put an exclamation point on what Zabe is saying. But you have to question what we're doing. Enforcement's based upon deterrence theory. Deterrence theory works when the punishment is severe enough that people will stop doing it, and it's certain enough that people know if they engage in the transgression, then they're going to get caught and punished. Those two conditions almost are never met, and then the collateral damage is often supersedes any type of benefit we get from traditional enforcement, especially from communities that are basically targeted by enforcement. Well, one role for them that we have actually seen in some communities, which could be more beneficial, is if you do have law enforcement officers on the beat, and they've been in place for a while, they tend to sort of pick up some patterns. They can actually be a good eyes on the street, if you will, for people designing, maybe even doing some tactical work. The designers, the people in public works, they can relate patterns that they're seeing of, you know, on this arterial, few drivers are yielding. It looks like most people are crossing outside of the marked crossings in this location. We might need a safe crossing here. Or when they get off of this bus that's really popular, they need a safe crossing. So these things around them being kind of keen observers of the system, we've seen that work quite well. There's a synergy there between the designers and law enforcement. But yeah, Tazabe, right now it's sort of a, I wouldn't say a necessary evil. I mean, what we like to see, however, is more community enforcement, more self-enforced roadways, but also just being a sort of norm that if we do drive, we drive sensibly. We drive being mindful of other people in our community, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess I would just agree with all that. I would add for those maybe early on in their Vision Zero work, so communities that are just thinking about action plans, or maybe they're updating their action plan. And I know I'm focusing on action plan a lot, not like, oh, if it's in a plan, it's perfect and you're going to do it perfectly, but it's a great way to open a conversation in your community that may not be happening. And let's just be honest, we could talk about this in a big aspirational way. In the end, a lot of people probably on this call are transportation planners and engineers and advocates for things like walking and biking. You know, do you have super strong relationships with the police today? Maybe not, and that's not a fault, it's just reality. How then are you going to integrate this conversation? And it does need to be a conversation for change into your work. I would say think about really practical steps and borrow or lean on others. For instance, in developing a Vision Zero action plan or updating it or coming back and reviewing it every week or month or quarter, really build in how are we moving from the ease to a safe system approach? What does that look like? How are the strategies and the actions? Go through every single one, whether it's enforcement or education or engineering. Go through, and again, you don't need to put them in those E's, but go through all your strategies and actions and ask the question, are these proven to be effective and equitable? How do we know that? What questions do we have? Let's dig deeper into that. I'm not pretending that's going to be a quick and easy conversation. You're probably going to get lots of resistance politically, but you get it on the table. And I would say Vision Zero should be and can be a vehicle, no pun intended there, but a vehicle to bring those conversations to a group. It's not the only group, but a group of stakeholders that are in roles of influence. I think Zabi, you were inferring of like, okay, as a transportation planner, you may or may not, you may not be pushing enforcement. That might not be your thing at all. You might say, oh, that's way over there. I don't do that. I design roads. I feel good. But we are part of this system, right? We are part of it. And if we're not actively calling it out and trying to change it, I would say we're not doing enough. So how are you integrating that into your broader work?
I want to come back around partly because I think we've touched on a few things, but to just sort of bring them all together, and also because there's people sort of buzzing in my ear. And I think it's important to point out that we are in a place where we have a hammer, and we see something that seems like a nail, and that we have this one hammer, and we just want to use it. And most people ask for traffic enforcement because they see this as the tool that is in use. They see how well resourced police departments are and emergency response. And that's on us. That's on policymakers who set budgets, who set priorities, who have decided this is how our world should be organized. And this is how we're going to sort of respond to these problems. Should the police be the first call for every single type of response? No, I mean, we're starting to see a little bit of a crack in that where, now we're moved from just 911. Oh, we have 311, what are some other ways that we can respond? And I think, again, that we live in somewhat of a punitive world. And you've talked about this as well in your book, Jessie, where it's sort of like people recognize this one thing as the way that we've organized our system. And it's either an accident or someone's at fault. And that one person is to blame rather than the system. And right now our system is punitive and we have one response to it. And I think that's why we need to change. And that's why people are asking for that same thing all the time. It's what they know.
That makes a lot of sense. We have just a few minutes left. And so I was hoping we could do a lightning round. If everyone could give us one specific actionable step that folks on this panel can take to shift their municipality away from education and or enforcement this year or in the next 5 years. Like what's one thing you can do in your community to start to shift the mindset?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I would say, again, thinking of somebody at the local or state level, whether you're in government or an advocate, look at the work you're doing. And again, this is not meant to figure point or blame for not doing perfectly, but self-reflect on it, right? In your work plan, in your Vision Zero action plan, how much are you leaning on the E's? How much are you kind of segregating and siloing? How much are you shifting? And even if you have questions, what does that mean to shift the way we're setting these things up, to shift to a safe system approach? Spend some time looking at that, analyzing that, thinking about that, and reach out to one of us if you want to help, think about ways to do that better. But that's something we can all do in our own work.
Thanks, Leah. Jessie, thank you for the question. There's so many things, but if I were to distill it to one, I think I would complement what Leah's saying by really start reflecting on the role that we're playing within this. So if you're a designer, then the role you play is helping shape the physical environment people are operating in. Research, I think we sort of lift up good examples, provide some, I think, good understanding of why we are the way we are here and some pathways to change. But I think if we can think about the role we can play that's in service to altering, however small, the physical or social and political environment people are operating in, that recognize this as a broader system problem with regulation, with our physical environment, then we'll be in a better place, because we're not going to be focusing on the individual road users involved. We really need to get away from that. So if we can play our part with taking the discourse away from those two people or those groups involved in these incidents, we'd be much better off.
I have so many thoughts on this. I think one is just to look to the people who are already working on this in your local environment. There are likely community organizations or advocates, or maybe there's a planner in the corner or a designer in the corner who's like, please, someone just listen to me, right? Like, figure out who that person is, ask around, and uplift them and work with them. If there isn't such a person, become that person. I think it's important to figure out, how do we turn the tide, and to make sure that we're part of that, and make sure that we are changing the way that we individually talk about this work, that we are educating ourselves and really amplifying the voices of people who are doing this work already. Everyone kind of needs to be an advocate for real outcomes, and that outcome is safer, sustainable, more equitable streets. And it's going to take time and effort, but the best way to do that is to educate ourselves and to amplify those voices that are already working on it.
That is a beautiful note to end on. I could have continued this conversation for another 2 hours. So just wow. And thank you to everyone for sharing your expertise. Thanks to everyone who joined us today and for the great questions. And again, a sincere thank you to our panel of experts for taking the time to teach us so much today. As you bring today's lessons back to your communities, I'd urge you all to question the 3 E's approach when it's presented as an equivalent to safer systems or a key element of Vision Zero. And if your fellows still insist that education and enforcement are key, perhaps suggest new targets. It's time to start enforcing regulations on our automakers, perhaps. And it's time to start educating our road designers and policymakers, traffic engineers. It might work. Okay, that's all for us. Everyone have a great day and enjoy the rest of the panels. Thank you for being here. And thank you again to all our panelists for our expertise.